Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Near the end of Book 2 of his work on anger, specifically in Chapter 31, Seneca has a number of reflections and words of advice that provide a very helpful practice for heading off anger that otherwise we're likely to feel. And it has to do with the connection between perceived unfairness or unrightness in a certain sense and what our expectations are, many of which are very unrealistic, particularly when we get to talking about enemies and bad people. So he tells us at the beginning of this chapter, there's two things that stir up anger, that lead to it, concitat, right? And so one of these is that we have an impression, a species, or it appears to us, videtur, that we have been wronged, that some injury, injuria, has taken place. Okay, that's nothing new. And then another part of this, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle's definition of anger as well, we think that the wrong has been done unfairly. And the word that he uses there is inique. So this is the word that we, in a stronger sense, get iniquity from. So somebody humiliated us, they harmed us, they did something to us that we didn't like, and we think that it was wrong that they did that wrong, right? We feel that some sort of expectation has been violated. And then he goes on and he says, when people judge things to be unfair, it's usually for, one of two main reasons. So one is they think that they shouldn't have suffered those things. Pati non debuerunt, right? There's a debere there, meaning how things should be, and so that they shouldn't be this way. I shouldn't have suffered this. So, oftentimes we're making exceptions. We're like, well, I understand that traffic has to flow in a certain way, but they should have let me in when I tried to merge, right? They shouldn't have been on their phone and cut me off. Or, that friend should have invited me to that special occasion. They should have checked that the invitation was in the mail or the email or whatever else it's going to be. So when things don't, we think that we shouldn't have suffered something, we get upset. And then sometimes we're just upset because it was unexpected, non speraverent. And this word doesn't just mean expectation, it also means to hope. So space is hope in Latin. So what we were not hoping for, what we didn't expect, and we think that those things are unfair, and so we, as he says, we reckon to be inappropriate, indignia, right? Going against our own dignity. Things that are unexpected, inopinata. And, he says we can see examples of this with all sorts of trivial things in our domestic arrangements and our friends' carelessness. We perceive these as wrongs, and we get angry about it. And it could be as simple as like, who moved the remote? Where did it go? Why is it between the seat cushions? I'm mad about that, right? I can't watch my show now.
when really you just find the remote and it's a trivial thing. Nobody was trying to screw you over by placing it on the couch where it fell between the cushions. Same thing with our friends' carelessness. They mention something that we're sensitive about, and they weren't even thinking about it, but we get mad at them. Why are we getting mad at them? Because we think that they should have treated us with greater care. We had an expectation. And now, if you have lots and lots of expectations about people who you are living with, people who you are friends with, even just sort of neutral companions on a bus, a train, an airplane, you are probably going to be disappointed because you're not the center of the universe. Not everybody is thinking about the expectations that you have. I mean, if you're paying them for a service and you're paying them the sort of money that gets you exclusivity, maybe you have a better reason for expecting special treatment. But the rest of us, no, that's not the case. So Seneca then goes on and says, well, somebody could object. What about when we get upset over what it is that enemies say or do, or perhaps even plan? Why do the wrongs our enemies do upset us? And he says, well, it's really quite simple. Because we have expectations about them. We didn't expect them to do the things that they did, or we expected them to do it, but not on that scale. We might even say not at that time, not before those people, not in this way, not quite so damaging. And Seneca says, well, what the hell is wrong with you? They're your enemies. What is it to be an enemy? It's somebody who actually wants to do harm to you. Why would you not expect them to do harm to you? Why would you expect them to do the opposite of that? And he says, this is an effect of excessive self-love. We judge that we should be undisturbed even by our enemies, the very people who are least likely to leave us undisturbed. And then he says, each of us has within us the mind of a monarch, the mind of a king, wanting to be the exception to the general rule. This is a very interesting idea. We want to be granted, as he calls it, complete freedom of action, licentiam, license. We often transliterate it that way. So complete freedom of action to do whatever it is that we want, but we don't want other people to have that same freedom of action, right? He says, not wanting it to be used against us. So we're also cool with other people having freedom of action, just so long as it doesn't impact us. Now, how does this apply to enemies? Why the hell would you not assume that your enemy has just as much freedom of action as you do and is going to use it because they're your enemy to try to screw with you, to try to humiliate you, to try to harm you, to try to injure you, or people that you're connected with? And the answer is, well, either ignorance, ignorancia, right? Or arrogance, insolentia. We get the word insolent from this. Thinking that as we used to say, you're getting too big for your britches. Britches are pants. You think that you're a bigger person than you actually are. And he says, how is it strange if bad deeds proceed from bad people? How is it novel, right? How is it new or strange if an enemy does harm? Not just an enemy. If a friend offends, a son slips, a slave does wrong. Fabius, he says, used to say, I didn't reckon, was the most shameful excuse for a general. And Seneca says, I think it's the most shameful for a human being. So we should have realistic expectations of other people. We shouldn't expect them to be angels. We shouldn't expect them to think more highly of us or respect us in ways that they don't. We should be brutally honest with ourselves about what people think, which is probably they don't think about us very much, or if they do, they probably think that we're not so great as we would say. And so he's going to close this discussion by saying that we really need to be on guard, right? He says, reckon and be on the watch for everything, even in a good character. Now, what's being translated there as good character is actually good habits. In bonis moribus, mos moris is the term for habit or custom. So this is often used in Latin to talk about a person's totality of habits, their character. So even in a good character or in good mores, something rough, asperrius, remains. So, in a just person, they can be just, but they're not going to be just in exactly the way that you want them to or talk about it the way that you want them to. Get used to it, he would say. He says human nature yields minds that are treacherous, ungrateful, lustful, impious. So when you're forming a judgment about a single person's character, their mores, right, you should actually think about the character of human beings generally or at large, de publicis. So the mores of the crowd, of the people that you're accustomed to run across. You'll not be surprised then when you find out that the person who you think is special isn't actually all that extraordinary, and they behave in ways similar to others. So he says, reckon there will always be something to offend you. No steersman has ever unfurled all his sails so carefree he didn't keep at hand the tackle to take them in. So there's a nautical metaphor. When you let your sails out, you're becoming vulnerable to the winds, right? So hold on to them. Don't just unfurl your sails and think everything's going to be great. A storm could come, in which case you got to furl those sails back in. You got to have your tackle handy. So what is your tackle in this case? Realistic expectations about human beings, whether they're just general human beings, enemies, friends, and people you share a household with. If you do this and you don't expect people to treat you in perfect ways or even better ways than they treat themselves, you're probably going to be less angry. And so if you can curb those unrealistic and unfounded expectations, you can remove one of the causes, very common cause, for your own lapsing into anger.